Hello everyone, welcome back to MixBuzz TV, mixing and mastering tutorials on YouTube. Part 8 of our ultimate compression tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at sidechain compression, specifically external sidechain compression, because we already talked about internal sidechain. This is a very important concept because the way a compressor reacts, it depends on what it's seeing. So when you just put a compressor on the insert of a track, the compressor just sees and listens to the track as is and reacts to it. Pretty straightforward. With internal sidechain filtering and EQing, we can tailor what the compressor hears of this track and focus the attention of the compressor to just the high end or just the low end, removing some parts of the frequency spectrum that we don't want the compressor to hear and to react to. With external sidechain, we take this to a whole different level, because with external sidechain, what happens is the compressor will listen to a different track while compressing the track in which we open the compressor. So for example, let's take the more common trick that you see external sidechain compression used on, which is sidechaining a kick drum to the bass. And here we have an example of it. Let's open our Oxford Dynamics. We have a drum and a bass line. This is not a whole mix, it's just part of it. And when the kick drum hits, the compressor will duck the level of the bass. This is the trick that made external sidechain compression popular or well known to most people. So let's listen to it. Okay, so how does it work? Well, in this case, I have my drum here, which is all these green and bluish tracks. But I made a copy of my kick drum, which is this track here in yellow. And I'm not sending this copy of the kick to my main output, so it's not going anywhere, but it's sent to an aux bus, which I called kick snare sidechain, and I'm using this channel to send kick and snare for sidechaining, whether it's compression or reverbs or anything else. So this kick, which is not going to any output, is going to this aux bus in pre-fader. Okay, on this track here, the bass track, I opened my Oxford Dynamic, and next to the keychain, I selected the same aux bus where I'm sending my kick drum, the snare, the kick and snare sidechain. Okay, it's here. So at this point, I click this button. What this button does is it activates the external sidechain, meaning the compressor is now listening to my aux bus, in which there is my kick drum, and is compressing the bass, reacting to that track. Settings are nothing special. As I said, this is not a finished mix, it's just a tracking project going on. So let's hear just the bass without the sidechain compression. Okay, with the sidechain compression. Okay, so as you can see from how the compressor is reacting, every time this kick here hits, this bass track gets compressed. Let's hear the whole mix with and without. Without first. with. Okay, so the settings are usually, I like fast attack for stuff like that, and the release needs to be in time with the song. Otherwise, the effects will not be pleasant. So play with the release or actually calculate the release based on the BPM of the song. This is very important. More than any other control, the release is what will make the compressed track, in this case the bass, moving in time and breathing in time with the song. In this case, external sidechain compression is used as a special effect, let's call it this way, meaning you can clearly hear the bass ducking under every hit of the kick, and you can hear it pumping. And in some genre, like dance music mostly, is pretty common. You use external sidechain this way very often. But this is not the only way to use it. You can use it to make space in a dense mix. For example, when you have big heavy guitars and big bass, and the drum is big too, so you might have a hard time making the transients of the drum coming up from this wall of guitars and bass and vocals most time too. Or maybe you have an 808 with a synth bass, and in that bass frequency range there's a lot of stuff going on at the same time. So with sidechain compression you can duck one element in time with the other, so that the mix doesn't get muddy, it doesn't get too boomy in the low end. But this is not, again, the only way. Kick and bass, it just happens to be the most known trick. Let me open another session now and let me show you how you can use it, for example, on snare with electric guitars. So here another session, a completely different genre. I'm going to show you how to use external sidechain to make a snare poke out from this wall of electric guitars. Here we have the song. Okay, so especially when we have the big long chords, the guitars and the bass are very powerful, and you might start to lose the snare hits, the snare snap. And so external sidechain compression can come in handy in this case. Okay, so I have my snare track here, okay, that I'm sending both at the drum bus and at the snare verb. So I'm already sending the snare to two aux buses. And to save time, I'm gonna use the snare verb track because I know I'm sending just the snare to that aux bus. So the snare is sent pre-fader to that aux bus. I'm opening, I have my all guitars stem here, and I'm opening in this track my aux for dynamics, and here next to the key sign I'm selecting the snare verb, so the same bus that I'm sending my snare. I'm activating compress, and I'm activating the key input. In this way the compressor will hear what is coming in the aux bus, in our case our snare, and will compress the guitars. So let's hear just the guitars with the compression. Okay. Okay, so in this case, I would automate these sidechain compression just for the chords and not the part before or after it, because it's not that musical. But actually, let me select that part alone. But yeah, And the compressor is now ducking the signal of the guitars every time that the snare hits. And this, it might help the snare to come out from the mix, to be heard in the mix, without turning the level of the snare up, which will eat up headroom on the master bus and other things. So let's hear the whole mix with the sidechain compression, which was a little too much right now. Let's hit it without. With. Okay. I'm keeping the release kind of slowish right now to make the effect a little more obvious to hear. But what I would do is I would not care about distortion due to too fast release in this case, because we're compressing electric guitars that it actually might help too. But it is not, even at the extreme settings, this kind of processing, it result in a pretty transparent action, because once again, when the compressor is ducking the guitars, you hear the snare, so you don't really pay attention to the compression. You don't really hear it, the compression, if it's done right. Okay, faster release. Okay, and you can adjust the release. You need to adjust the release in a way that you get the effect, but you don't hear the effect. So you get the snare poking out of the walls of the guitars, but you don't hear the guitar pumping unless you want it as an effect, which can be cool in some cases. In the same fashion, you can use the example that we've seen before with a kick drum ducking the level of the bass. But in a mix like this, you can use external sidechain in a more invisible way, in a more subtle way. In this case, to make the bass get out of the way a little bit when the kick drum hits. Let's try this, for example. So let's open our Sonox Dynamics and let's go find our kick drum, which is up here. And I'm sending the kick drum to kick verb. So let's open up that bus here, kick verb. And of course, the compressor is opened on the bass truck, okay? Kick drum is coming in our sidechain aux bus. We activate compression and we activate our key input. Unbypass it, just listen to the bass and start compressing. Okay, so as you can see and hear, when the kick hits, the bass is getting compressed. Of course, I'm exaggerating the settings right now. Let's hear it in a mix with the compression. Let's make up a bit. Okay, it's not so obvious, especially in this mix because the guitars are so loud, but that is the concept. Actually, we can do it on the guitars, and we used our kick drum instead of the snare, just for an example. Okay, so without it. With. Again, these settings are way too much that I would ever use on a mix, but it's just to make it apparent and easier to hear. So you can use external sidechain for a lot of things, not just kick and bass or snare and guitars. One situation in which I find myself using sidechain compression a lot is, for example, with vocals and guitars, especially in a mix like this where there's a lot of power. The guitars are usually very loud, very big, they take a lot of space. The vocals sometimes, especially if the guitar plays a lot during the verse, they might take too much space, and ducking the level of the guitars according to the vocals, it helps the vocals to come out without actually you having to lower the volume of the guitars. Nobody wants that, right? So, but these are just few examples. You can use external sidechain on many things, on effects, for example, and we have a video on how to make your reverbs more dynamic using sidechain compression. So let's recap really fast. The technique is pretty easy. You send whatever is your trigger, so your kick or your snare or your vocals, to an aux bus. You open a compressor that has external sidechain capabilities. In this case, I'm using Oxford Dynamics, which is one of my favorite compressors. You select next to the key the same aux bus that you send your trigger track to, and you activate the external sidechain and you compress. So this is it for our external sidechain compression video, part 8 of our ultimate compression tutorial. If you have any specific question about sidechain compression or compression in general, just write it in the comment or send us a message and we will get back at you. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and see you next time.